What if the most important American nuclear story of the year was not a launch, not a war plan, but a deadline beaten in near silence? Because that is exactly what happened with the B-6113, and the real story is far more serious than the loudest headlines make it sound. If you like videos that cut through hype and tell you what really matters, hit like, subscribe, and share this with one person who still thinks nuclear weapons stopped changing decades ago. Let's start with the part almost everyone gets wrong. When people hear that America's new nuclear bomb got finished early, many jump straight to the most extreme conclusion. They imagine an emergency crash program. They imagine Washington rushing to build a new weapon because some crisis suddenly forced its hand. They imagine this is a sign that a nuclear strike is around the corner. That is not what the official record shows. What actually happened is more specific, more measured, and in some ways more revealing. In October 2023, the Department of Defense announced that the United States would pursue a modern variant of the B-61 nuclear gravity bomb called the B-61 Auto-13. The reason given was not one single breaking event. It was a changing security environment. That matters. It means this weapon was not presented as a panic response. It was presented as part of a longer strategic shift. Then the timeline started to surprise people. In May 2025, the first B-6113 production unit was assembled almost a year ahead of the original target date. Think about that for a second. In one of the most tightly controlled, technically demanding areas on Earth, a major nuclear weapon milestone landed early. Not on time. Early. Then in July 2026, another official milestone followed. The National Nuclear Security Administration announced that it had completed the diamond stamping of all canned subassemblies planned for the current fiscal year 3 months ahead of schedule at the Y-12 National Security Complex. That phrase sounds dry, almost designed to make normal people scroll away, but this is where the story lives. Because behind language like diamond stamping and canned subassemblies is a very simple fact. The United States did not just announce a weapon on paper. It pushed critical pieces of a real modernization program through the system faster than expected. And when that happens in the nuclear world, people who watch defense planning very closely pay attention. Now here's the next thing that needs to be said clearly. Finished early does not mean built overnight. It does not mean improvised. It does not mean reckless. The official explanation points in the opposite direction. The B-6113 used proven production capabilities that had already supported the B-6112. Officials said decades of B-61 design and qualification data gave engineers confidence to take calculated risks, streamline design gates, and move faster than a standard schedule would usually allow. In plain English, they were not inventing everything from zero. They were building a new variant by standing on a large mountain of old experience. And that changes how you should read this whole story. The headline is not really about one bomb. The headline is about a system proving it can move with speed when it decides something matters enough. So what is the B-6113 actually for? Officially, the answer is also more precise than a lot of online commentary. The Department of Defense said the B-61 Auto-13 would strengthen deterrence by giving the president additional options against certain harder and large area military targets. That wording matters so much. Not softer targets, not everyday battlefield targets, not a random expansion of destructive power just because bigger sounds scarier. Harder and large area military targets. That points to a very specific strategic problem. Over time, major powers learn from each other. If one side becomes very good at striking fixed military sites, the other side tries to make those sites harder to destroy. It buries them deeper. It spreads them out. It hardens them. It protects them. It creates the hope that enough concrete, steel, rock, and distance will force an enemy to back off. The B-6113 exists in that world. It is a response to the problem of sanctuary. The simple idea that some targets may start to feel safe because they are hard enough, deep enough, or wide enough. That is why the official language is not casual. It is deliberate. Harder targets, large area targets, extra options. This is the language of deterrence, not impulse. There's another misunderstanding that spreads fast whenever people talk about nuclear weapons. Some online posts treat every bomb in the B-61 family as if they are all basically the same thing with a new number slapped on the outside. That is lazy thinking. Families of weapons evolve over time. Variants can differ in mission, yield, delivery certification, and how planners think about them. According to the official release, the B-6113 will only be certified for delivery by strategic bomber aircraft and deployed from bases in the continental United States. That alone tells you a lot. This is not being described as a weapon for casual forward use. It is not being framed as a routine battlefield tool. It sits inside a much more serious part of deterrence logic. A bomber-based nuclear option carries military meaning, but it also carries political meaning. Bombers can be launched, seen, tracked, signaled, recalled, and used as part of pressure long before a weapon is ever dropped. Even before you reach the point of release, the platform itself sends a message. And this leads to the biggest emotional misunderstanding in the whole debate. People often hear the words nuclear bomb and think the story begins and ends with destruction. But most of the time, the real power of nuclear weapons is psychological. It is about what they make other states believe. It is about doubt. It is about forcing an adversary to ask hard questions before a war ever starts or before a crisis gets worse. If you are a planner in another country and you have spent years building military sites you believe are secure because they are hardened or spread out, then news like this lands differently. You are not only thinking about blast effects, you are thinking about uncertainty. You are thinking about whether your safest facilities are still safe enough. You're thinking about whether your assumptions are aging faster than your concrete. That is why the early finish matters. Speed changes perception. A delayed program tells one story, an early program tells another. A delayed program says friction, weakness, bottlenecks, and strain. An early program says capacity, discipline, and urgency. Even if the stockpile does not grow, confidence can grow, and confidence is a weapon all by itself in the world of deterrence. But before we go any further, we need to strip away two bad narratives that ruin almost every discussion about this topic. The first bad narrative says, this is proof the United States is preparing to use a nuclear weapon soon. The official material does not support that. In fact, the 2023 fact sheet said the fielding of the B-6113 was not in response to any specific current event. That line deserves real attention because it directly pushes back against panic-driven interpretations. The second bad narrative says this is just bureaucratic theater, just a press release trying to sound impressive. That also misses the point. The first production unit being completed almost a year early is not just decorative language. The later announcement that planned fiscal year canned subassemblies were completed 3 months early is not decorative language either. These are real milestones in a highly sensitive program. They reflect actual movement in the nuclear production enterprise. So the truth sits in the middle, and the middle is where the most important stories usually hide. No, this does not mean a nuclear strike is imminent, but no, it is not meaningless either. It means the United States is showing that it can modernize part of its deterrent force faster than many people expected. And it is doing so in a way designed to address a specific class of military targets. That should get your attention, even if you never want these weapons used, maybe especially if you never want them used. Because the logic of deterrence is uncomfortable by design. It says peace is sometimes preserved not by kindness alone, not by hope alone, but by making sure potential enemies believe that their worst calculations could fail. If this breakdown is helping you see the story behind the headline, tap subscribe now. Because the next few minutes explain why one quiet production schedule can tell you more about the future than a week of dramatic cable news. Now, let's slow down and understand the B-6113 in plain language. First, it is a gravity bomb. That phrase can sound old-fashioned, as if we are talking about museum technology, but gravity bomb simply refers to the way it is delivered. It falls from an aircraft rather than flying under its own power like a missile. That does not mean primitive. The official release says the B-6113 includes the same modern safety, security, and accuracy features as the B-6112. Those words matter. Safety, security, accuracy. This is not a story about reviving some crude Cold War relic exactly as it was. It is a story about adapting a long-standing nuclear family into a newer strategic form. Second, it is not described as increasing the total number of weapons in the U.S. stockpile. This is one of the most important facts in the entire story, and too many people skip it because it sounds less dramatic than a giant number. The 2023 Defense Department fact sheet said the B-6113 will not increase the overall number of weapons in the stockpile. It also said the number of B-6112s to be produced will be lowered by the same amount as the number of B-6113s produced. In other words, this is not officially being framed as simple expansion. It is a change in mix. That distinction matters because capability is not just about quantity. Two arsenals can have the same number of weapons and still look very different in the minds of planners. If you change accuracy, mission profile, delivery method, or the kind of targets a weapon is meant to address, then you have changed the strategic picture even without changing the total count. Third, the B-6113 is linked to the retirement path of older systems. The fact sheet says it will provide additional options even while the department works to retire legacy systems such as the B-83-1 and the B-61-7. It gives the weapon another layer of meaning. This is not only about adding something new, it is also about managing a transition from older capabilities to newer ones. That is often how major military modernization really works. Not as a clean replacement where one thing disappears and another instantly takes over, but as a careful handoff shaped by changing doctrine, changing technology, and changing threats. And that brings us to a harder question. Why would the United States feel pressure to update this part of its nuclear posture at all? The easiest answer is that defense planning is a competition between protection and penetration. One side hides better. The other side improves its ability to reach what is hidden. One side builds hardened military targets. The other side develops options meant to hold those targets at risk. Then the cycle repeats. It is grim, but it is not new. It is one of the oldest patterns in military history. What makes it more disturbing in the nuclear context is the scale of the consequences. Once nuclear weapons enter the logic of target planning, the stakes rise immediately. Even if the entire purpose is deterrence rather than use, the fact that planners want certain targets to remain vulnerable tells you something serious about the world they think they're living in. It tells you they do not assume goodwill will do the job by itself. They do not assume hard targets can be ignored. They do not assume the old toolkit is enough forever. This is where people sometimes make another mistake. They think modernization must mean a more aggressive policy. But modernization can also mean a system trying to keep deterrence credible without simply multiplying weapons. The official material on the B6113 leans heavily into that logic. Additional options, harder targets, large area targets, no increase in overall stockpile size, use of proven production capabilities. These are not random phrases. Together, they tell a coherent story. The United States is trying to preserve certain strategic options while updating the tools involved. That still does not make the story harmless. It makes it more serious, because the most consequential military changes are often the ones that happen quietly, under language that sounds technical enough to avoid public emotion. Diamond stamping, production unit, design gates, stockpile mix. These phrases do not sound like the end of the world. But they are tied to weapons built for the most extreme scenarios humans can imagine. And that contrast is part of why this story feels so strange. The process sounds administrative. The implications do not. Imagine a factory milestone in almost any other industry. A car line finishes early. A phone line finishes early. A new microchip plant beats schedule. Investors cheer. Consumers wait for prices and features. But in the nuclear world, finishing early does something different. It sends a message across governments. It tells allies something about reliability. It tells rivals something about resolve. It tells defense analysts that an industrial base many thought had grown too slow may be moving with more confidence than expected. And if that trend is real, it matters far beyond one bomb. Because nuclear weapons are not only military objects, they are industrial objects too. They depend on people, materials, quality control, facilities, certification, and institutional memory. If any of those pieces degrade badly enough, deterrence can start to look less convincing from the outside. Not because the weapons vanish, but because the system behind them looks brittle. That is part of what makes the B6113 story so revealing. It is not just about a finished unit. It is about an enterprise showing signs of competence under pressure. The official May 2025 release even stressed that the program was completed on a greatly accelerated schedule, and that hardware test builds could be manufactured just 3 months after the program received authorization and appropriation from Congress. That is a striking line, not because it proves magic, not because it proves everything will now move fast forever, but because it proves the system found ways to cut time inside one of the most demanding processes in government. And when a state becomes better at doing hard things quickly, every rival takes notes. If you are still here, quick favor, leave a like, send this video to one smart friend, and stay with me to the end. The real question is not how powerful this weapon sounds, but what its early finish tells us about America's ability to rebuild strategic muscle. Let's talk about that rebuilding part, because it may be the most important angle of all. For years, the public conversation around American nuclear infrastructure often leaned in one direction. Slow, aging, burdened, short on momentum, short on fresh expertise, full of old systems, long timelines, and technical challenges that seemed almost impossible to speed up without risking mistakes. Whether that picture was fully fair or only partly fair, it shaped expectations. Many people assumed this part of the national security system would move carefully at best and painfully at worst. Then the B6113 timeline arrived and challenged that assumption. Again, the details matter. The first unit was assembled less than 2 years after the program was first announced, according to the official release. That made it, in the words of the same release, one of the most rapidly developed and fielded weapons since the Cold War. That is not casual phrasing. Officials knew exactly how that line would land. It was meant to land hard. Why? Because timelines are evidence. They are a way of proving seriousness without firing a shot. If a government wants to show that its deterrent still has life, it can say strong things. It can issue warnings. It can move aircraft. It can hold exercises. But it can also show that real programs are reaching real milestones faster than expected. That kind of evidence is sticky. It does not disappear when a news cycle moves on. It becomes part of how other states assess capability. And capability in strategy is often judged less by speeches than by repeated performance. Now think about what the official explanation tells us about how this happened. Engineers used decades of B-61 design data. They accepted calculated risks, they streamlined or combined design gates, they moved into production sooner than a normal schedule would have allowed. None of that sounds glamorous, but all of it sounds like an organization that understood the assignment clearly and decided delay was not acceptable. There's something else hiding inside that story too. Trust, not political trust, technical trust. The kind of trust institutions build when teams believe enough in their accumulated knowledge to move faster without feeling blind. That matters in every advanced field, but especially here. A system cannot accelerate safely if it has no confidence in its own data, people, and processes. So when the B6113 moved early, it suggested more than urgency. It suggested institutional memory was being translated into action. That has consequences far beyond one variant. Because once an industrial and scientific system proves it can compress time in one major program, people immediately begin asking what else it might do. Could other modernization efforts move faster? Could future timelines shrink? Could the bottlenecks that seem permanent turn out to be more flexible than expected? Could rivals, who assume long delays were built into the system, need to revise their assumptions? This is how strategic shock often works. Not always through explosions, sometimes through calendars. And that is why this story deserves more attention than it got. A country's ability to produce, certify, and field highly sensitive systems faster than expected is one of the clearest windows into what kind of strategic era may be coming next. But with that said, we also need discipline. It is easy to take an early milestone and turn it into a grand myth. That would be a mistake. One successful program does not erase every challenge. One fast timeline does not mean friction is gone. One early announcement does not mean every future effort will glide forward. Strategic analysis gets weak when it swings from one extreme to the other. So the smartest reading is balanced. The B6113 does not prove unstoppable perfection. It does prove real momentum. It does not prove imminent nuclear use. It does prove the United States wanted a specific capability enough to accelerate it. It does not prove an arms race in raw numbers. It does prove meaningful change in the shape and credibility of part of the arsenal. And for viewers trying to understand what actually happened, that balance matters more than fear marketing ever will. Now, let's go deeper into why the mission description is so revealing. Harder and large area military targets. That phrase tells you planners are thinking about problems that are not solved by simply having any nuclear bomb at all. They are thinking about fit, about whether the right tool exists for the right category of target. In strategy, that matters. A deterrent that looks large on paper can still have credibility gaps if decision makers believe certain target sets sit outside its most practical options. That is why the B6113 was described as adding options. Options are everything in deterrence. If leaders have too few credible choices, their threats can become less believable. If they have more tailored choices, their deterrent can look more usable in the abstract, even if they never intend to cross that line in reality. That last point is uncomfortable, but important. Sometimes the aim of nuclear modernization is not to make use more likely. It is to make deterrence more believable, by convincing rivals that the leadership would not be trapped between doing nothing and doing something wildly mismatched to the target. And once you understand that, the B6113 stops looking like a random addition. It starts looking like a carefully shaped answer to a gap planners did not want to leave open. There is also a moral tension here that should not be ignored just because the language of strategy can sound cool and calm. Every improvement in the credibility of nuclear deterrence rests on the shadow of real destruction. That is the deal with these weapons. Their political value comes from their imaginable consequences. The cleaner the briefing language becomes, the easier it is to forget that. But we should not forget it. When officials say additional options, they are talking about the most serious category of military decision any government can face. When they say harder targets, they are talking about places that would only matter in a crisis of the highest order. When they say deterrence, they are talking about trying to prevent catastrophe by making catastrophe believable. That is the paradox at the center of the entire nuclear age. And maybe that is why this story unsettles people, even when the facts are calm. A bomb finished early sounds administrative, but behind it is a reminder that the world's strongest states still spend huge effort preparing for scenarios they hope never happen. If that tension hits you too, don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment with the single biggest thing that surprised you. Subscribe for more calm breakdowns of serious topics, and share this video with someone who only saw the headline but missed the meaning. Now we need to answer the title question directly. What actually happened? Here is the clean version. The United States did not suddenly invent a completely new kind of nuclear weapon out of nowhere. It pursued a modern variant of the long-running B-61 gravity bomb family and named it the B-6113. Officials said this variant would provide the president with additional options against certain harder and large area military targets. They also said it would not increase the overall number of weapons in the stockpile because production of B-6112s would be lowered by the same amount as B-6113s produced. Then, the program moved faster than expected. In May 2025, officials announced the first B-6113 production unit had been assembled almost a year ahead of the original target date. Later, in July 2026, officials announced they had completed diamond stamping of all canned subassemblies planned for the current fiscal year, 3 months ahead of schedule. Those are the milestones. Those are the facts. No panic fantasy required, no minimization either. So why should anyone care? Because timelines reveal intent. Because capability backed by industrial speed is more convincing than capability stuck in paperwork. Because this tells allies that the United States is serious about maintaining a modern deterrent. Because it tells rivals that military sites they hoped would remain safely out of reach may not look as secure in long-term planning as they once did. And because it suggests the American nuclear enterprise may be regaining some of the pace that many assumed it had lost. That does not mean every alarmist interpretation is right. It means the underlying shift is real enough to deserve sober attention. The ending of this story is also not where many people expect it to be. The real takeaway is not that one bomb exists. Nuclear bombs have existed for a long time. The real takeaway is that modernization changes the logic around them. It changes what leaders think they can hold at risk. It changes how safe an adversary feels behind hardened protection. It changes the credibility of threats that may never need to be carried out. In other words, it changes calculations. And calculations are what shape history long before action does. A lot of people only notice defense issues when a missile flies, a conflict erupts, or a speech goes viral. But some of the deepest changes happen in quieter spaces. Inside plants, labs, approvals, schedules, and technical milestones. Places where history moves without dramatic music. Places where a date on a calendar can signal more than 1,000 hot takes ever will. That is exactly why the B-6113 story matters. Not because it gives us proof of a coming nuclear strike, not because it means the world changed overnight, but because it shows how the world is changing underneath the surface. The United States wanted a more modern option for certain harder and large area military targets. It built that option faster than expected by leaning on proven capabilities and accumulated design knowledge. It did so while insisting this was not about increasing stockpile numbers, but about adjusting capability. And in doing that, it sent a message that reached far beyond the walls of the facilities where the work happened. That message is simple. America wants potential enemies to know that the deepest, toughest, most protected military targets cannot be assumed safe, just because they are hard to reach. Whether you find that reassuring or terrifying probably depends on where you stand in the world. But either way, it is a serious message. And there is one last layer that makes this even more important. Most nuclear weapons are never used. Their power lives in the decisions they prevent, the aggression they discourage, the calculations they distort, and the caution they force into the minds of rivals. That means a weapon like the B-6113 can shape the world long before and hopefully without ever being dropped. That is the strange truth at the center of this story. The bomb's greatest effect may come from being seen, understood, and believed in, not from being detonated. So, when you hear that America's new nuclear bomb got finished early, do not stop at the headline. Ask the better question. What did that early finish prove? It proved that a difficult strategic capability was important enough to accelerate. It proved that the United States could turn an announced concept into an assembled production unit in less than 2 years. It proved that critical planned components for the fiscal year could be completed 3 months ahead of schedule. It proved that the deterrence conversation is still evolving, even when the public is not paying attention. And maybe most importantly, it proved that in the nuclear age, some of the biggest shifts do not arrive with a flash. They arrive with a quiet press release, a stamped component, a finished unit, and a message every serious government in the world knows how to hear. If you want more videos that slow down the noise, explain the stakes, and leave you with the part that actually matters, hit subscribe. Share this with someone who loves serious geopolitics, and come back for the next one, because the stories that change the world are often the ones that look boring until you understand them.